Welcome. Thanks for coming. This is a part of a community call to confront hate. And the presentation, this session is called This America. We're so lucky to be here with Chisao, Hata, and Jennifer Fang. My name is Erin Schmidt. I'm here representing Vanport Mosaic Festival. And during the session, Chisao is going to give a talk with some slides, and then her and Jennifer, who's from the Japanese American Museum of Oregon, are going to have a conversation. And then there should be about 10 minutes at the end for some questions and comments from the audience. So please submit submit those questions, comments via Whova. There should be a place to do that to the right of the video. And you can submit that throughout the talk. It's fine anytime. If I can check in there during the presentation, I will. Otherwise, we'll just take a look at that at the end. Everyone, please stay muted throughout the presentation. We'd really appreciate that. And as you probably heard, the session is being recorded. We will likely use it or part of it during the Vanport Mosaic Festival this year, but I believe it will also be up on the Jewish Federation website. So there should be a link to the video there. Again, just submit your questions and comments at any point and we'll take a look at those. We'll have 10 minutes at the end. And give me one moment. I'm going to hand it over to Chisao to introduce herself and start her presentation. Okay, Chisao, over to you.
Hi. Well, I'd like to thank the Jewish Federation of Oregon, first of all, for hosting this amazing summit. And I have two organizations that are helping to sponsor this session today, the Japanese American Museum of Oregon and Vanport Mosaic. And I'd especially like to thank Erin for helping us with all the technical aspects. So my name's Chisao Hata, and I'm a movement artist, community activist, and most recently, Vanport Mosaic has called me their community weaver, which is great. So this is a part of my work that's designed to bring communities together to meet and to listen and to walk on the healing road. And we do this by offering space for people to share their stories, hopefully soon face to face. So in this last year, over 6,603 incidents of hate crimes towards Asian Americans have been recorded by the AAPI Stop Hate. These include verbal harassment, physical assault, and civil rights violations. These crimes are committed in America. A year of COVID, the rise of social justice, and our global awareness has risen, and we cannot go back. This is the America that many people of color have known. But do we know who we truly are? These hidden histories are necessary for all of us to learn in order to reshape and reform our broken systems and create an inclusive America. This America is the country we can rebuild by acknowledging the past. This America is my offering to the endeavor of including all the missing histories. We will lose nothing and will only gain from the rich diversity that makes America. So this history is clear in Oregon and across America. America was not made for all of us. We bought the dream. Our parents and grandparents believed in the dream. But America was built on racism, xenophobia, and hate. So today I'll share attitudes towards Japanese Americans that shaped laws, my personal journey, embracing my Asian American heritage and identity. As an artist, I continue to explore the intersection of art and activism. So in his essay, Poetry Within Earshot, Notes of an Asian American Generation from 1968 to 1978, poet, editor, and artist Russell C. Leong wrote, "Because I wanted to relearn and relive the stirrings of an Asian American generation, I sought out its poetry. For poetry is like a hammer, can nail down the times. And as the poet Rumi said, to speak a new language so that the world would be a new world. And Audre Lorde said that poetry gives a name to the nameless so that it can be thought. Because of my face, I am forever foreign. Where did you come from? And when are you going back? My face is from a subhuman race. My face was not to be trusted. My face was denied all constitutional rights under military necessity, now national security. My face is the alien who cannot become a true American. My face caused a global pandemic. Headlines from the San Francisco Chronicle in 1905. Official examining newly arrived Japanese. The article claimed that Japanese immigrants were crafty, evading the law and bringing frightful disease to schools in San Francisco. So most Japanese immigrated to the US between 1860 and 1907. I have these roots deep in my veins, these places with combination locks. So I am a Sansei, a third generation Japanese American. My grandfather, Gunichi Tamiyasu, married his picture bride, Chisao Tajima. And in 1916, eventually they settled in Hood River, Odell, Oregon. There were hundreds of farmers who worked in Oregon, Japanese American farmers, and they produced over 65% of the fruits and vegetables that were grown in Oregon. So I think there's a slide there. Yeah, I think that is of Hood River. So there were laws that excluded Chinese and other Asians. So in 1916, the Yellow Menace movie ads used yellowface and played off of white Americans' fear of people with Asian ancestry. The Yellow Menace portrays Asians and Mexicans as diabolical. The Asiatic Barred Zone Act, the Sunday Oregonian, described a bill that would ban Japanese immigration in a new way, a literacy test. The bill would also bar other Asian immigrants, including Hindus and all persons of the Mongolian or yellow race and the Malay or brown race. This bill became law in 1917. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 bans the immigration of Chinese laborers. And this law affected many of the Chinese, but also is when the United States turned to Japanese laborers. Oregon's 1923 alien land law was designed to shore up white economic status in the face of perceived racial threats. 1923, the Senate and the House passed the bill with one dissenting vote. The new law prohibited aliens ineligible to citizenship. It also were prohibited from owning or leasing land in Oregon and barred from the operation of pool halls, dance halls, pawn shops, and soft drink establishments. So I only met my grandfather once, and I never knew my grandmother, pictured here with my mother, because she died in childbirth with her 9th child when my mother was 16. My mother, Kesae Tamiyasu, or Kay, had a dream to become a nurse, as she was always sickly as a child and couldn't work in the orchard. And it might have been her responsibility to care for her younger siblings at the death of her mother, but she had this dream. So my grandfather took her to Portland's Nihonmachi, Japantown, where she was given shelter, food, guidance, and eventually entered Walla Walla College's pre-med program. She returned to Portland and graduated from the Portland Adventist Nursing School in 1939, the first Japanese American nurse in a class of all white students. So Nihon Machi, this was our home. Over 300 businesses in a vibrant community with living quarters in hotels, schools, open markets, restaurants, civic and religious organizations, midwives, doctors, and dentists. Nihon Machi, or Japantown, was once the heart of Japanese American community of Oregon and Southwest Washington, occupying 10 to 12 block area, a 10 to 12 block area north of West Burnside between Northwest 2nd and 6th Avenues. Then, 1941, the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Almost immediately, the FBI arrested Issei, or first generation Japanese, who were leaders in Nihon Machi. And over 200 were taken and imprisoned in Missoula, Montana. Their families had no knowledge of where they were, some for even 2 to 3 years. So February 19th was the issuance of this order, Executive Order 9066 by President Franklin Roosevelt. And it led to establishing military areas and the incarceration and justified the reason for military necessity was led by General DeWitt, who is quoted as saying, "A Jap is a Jap." It was in order to prevent espionage and spies operating along the West Coast. So approximately 4,000 were held at assembly centers in Portland while the military camps were being built. So Portlanders went to the now Expo Center, which this is a photograph of, and it was then known as the International Livestock Exposition Hall. So the animals were moved out and the people were moved in. From June to September, the hottest month of the year, the smells still remain with the survivors. Many of them were children then. So my parents and 120,000 West Coast Japanese and Japanese Americans lived for 3 to 5 years imprisoned in 10 concentration camps across America. They could only take what they could carry. Can you imagine that? Imagine this year of the pandemic, 1 year. People were held for 3 to 5 years in the concentration camps. It's a time that we can turn to empathize with the Japanese Americans who were taken against their will and under constant military surveillance. This was a total violation of the Bill of Rights. There was no due process, and unjust imprisonment is only one of the many racist acts of then and now. In Portland, our homes, our businesses, and community built in Japantown was locked and stolen, bank accounts frozen. We lost everything. And this happened to American citizens. There were 10 camps across the country, 10 main camps. And so following the bombing of Pearl Harbor, my mother was assigned by the U.S. Public Health Service to Mare Assembly Center in Phoenix, Arizona, where she became the 225th person incarcerated there before being imprisoned at the Poston camp, Camp 1. She made $19 a month as a professional person. And after many efforts, eventually my father, Tadashi, Ted, Hata, was able to join her in Poston from Los Angeles, Santa Anita racetrack. And they were married September 4th, 1942 in Poston. So upon requested release, and this is important to note that history, that because the war was over, people were not necessarily released. They had to request a release. My parents eventually drove east, and the short story is they ran out of gas in Des Moines, Iowa, and it was during gas rationing times. So they found an apartment on 27th and Forest, and years later they bought a house on 23rd, and that's where I grew up, 1800 23rd Street, Des Moines, Iowa. I went back to discover and uncover and find parts of me. It is amorphous, unseen, and yet in my blood and my breath, in my cells, as my DNA ancestors pulse to be heard, as they whisper to me in a language I never spoke. My parents made a new home and a new life without a community, without extended family, and in a city unfamiliar with the concentration camps. Executive Order 9066 shaped my identity, my culture, my community, and my family, who was fractured and shamed by this order. I grew up needing to justify and explain who I am. I often wonder, who would I have become if my family was not subjected to racist policies, failed leadership, or historic erasure? How much did I lose? How much did all of us lose? Who would I have become if my life was unaffected by these racist policies? How did I feel as a child when my teacher blamed me and the rest of the Japs for Pearl Harbor, as my class turned to stare at me decades later? So the feelings of a child who experiences racism, rejection, and stern judgment is a loss for our country. And as Americans, we become less human, less brave, less empathetic then and now. If we are truly caretakers of our earth and each other, we must heal from the traumas of racism. We must ensure that no action, law, or policy creates suffering for a few. Otherwise, we cannot create the democracy America can be. Remember my face. I am just like you. Remember this America. So along the waterfront in Old Town, you've probably all seen these 100 cherry trees that bloom in March and April. They're planted after the Japanese American Historical Plaza was built. On the plaza is a wall. The wall holds the history of Japanese Americans in Oregon through poetry on stones. This landscape architecture created by Robert Murase and Bill Nato ensures our permanence in this place that was once home of an entire community. Historic Old Town, Japantown, Chinatown. And now this plaza has become a place for many activities, many events, but some of them we call Never Again is Now, to help us remember what happened in the past and to stand up for those who can't stand up for themselves. In the summer of 2019, we stood in solidarity with survivors of the camps who stood in their 80s in protest at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. So I'd like to thank the Japanese American Museum of Oregon, which has just reopened. Their virtual opening was just May 6th, that you can see online and celebrate that opening with us. There's now limited openings available. And also, I'd like to raise up the Vanport Mosaic, who this year, in their 6th year, is creating their 6th festival to repair, restore, and reimagine in the historic North Park blocks. So as we all continue to rally with Black Lives Matter and other people of color in America to tell our stories, to demand that they be included, and together we will create this America. This is a logo that represents the 3 generations that work together on the redress movement, enclosed by the barbed wire. But I want to go on and have open this up to a conversation with Jennifer Fung, who is the Director of Education at the Japanese American Museum of Oregon. She's also a history professor at the University of Portland, and she is a board member of the Western Museum Association. We're very happy to have Jennifer here, and we're just going to discuss some things that have arisen not only from what I just talked about, but some other things that are more contemporary to our world today. So one of the things that I raised up in my talk was around, so welcome, Jennifer. Thank you for joining today.
Thanks for inviting me.
So, you know, I really tried to share with people, and without going into a lot of depth and details, but the struggle of identity. And I still, you know, question, like, who would I have become, or what would have happened to me if I would have grown up in an all, you know, Japanese community, or at least been exposed to one. And I found that my struggle for identity has lasted my entire life, starting out, you know, at a very early age, wondering why I was different and called out for being different. So why do you think it's important for us to deal with this search for identity, and really the trauma that I think as individuals we have felt from that experience?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I was really the part where you said that you had to grow up feeling the need to that you grew up constantly feeling the need to justify who you are. That, you know, and the questioning of how much did you lose because of these traumas. I mean, I think that in many ways, like that resonated with me, because I mean, of course, I didn't experience the same traumas as you or your family, but I think that there is that questioning of identity, or feeling the need to constantly justify or like qualify who you are, explain why you are in this country, you know, things like that. That's kind of why you and I do the work that we do, right? Like, I mean, it's like we would have probably been in other fields of work if it weren't for you know, this really intense interest in kind of unpacking that question. And I think that it is really important for, I mean, I think that it's important for all people of Asian descent and all people of color, but also for, you know, for white Americans too, to really unpack that, like, that aspect of identity, that element of, you know, where are your roots? From whom or from where do you come from? Because everyone comes from, somewhere. Everyone has roots somewhere. But for some reason, some groups of people, their roots are like weaponized or like used against them. And others, those roots become their privilege later on in life, or they grow up experiencing that privilege. So I guess I just think that it like almost doesn't matter who you are, like, or whatever your background is, knowing that background is vital to I think to imagining and understanding one's place within this society, and also being able to recognize, like, where do I fit in within this, and what can I do to make this better, or make this place better for everybody.
And I know that your family immigrated a lot later. So my family, has roots in the very beginning of Japanese American immigration to Oregon. But yours was much later, but still this effect, right, of questioning identity and fitting in, and it matters where you're born, right, where you're raised.
Yes, I mean, very much so. I loved the images that you shared of your family. They were just the first time I've ever seen them, so thanks for sharing. But my family came in the 1970s from Taiwan, and my family's history is one of displacement from China, from like mainland China to Taiwan, and then eventually immigrating to the United States following the loosening of restrictions in 1951 and 1965 for immigrants. And my family was part of a wave of, or my parents and my aunts and uncles were part of a wave of like white collar immigrants, coming to the United States. Like, my dad came to the United States because he had gotten a job as a radio broadcaster for the Voice of America. So he not only came over with kind of like to work for the US government, but he came over to work also, like, not in a field that's tied to like science or engineering. So there's in many ways they're kind of outliers, or their story doesn't really fit in, is different from these earlier generations of immigrants. But yet for me, and for a lot of other folks with backgrounds like mine, that question of identity still persists, and it is like it's something that, I mean, for me, it like informs, it's my frame of reference for everything. It's how I view the world.
Now, I want to get this right, because the Issei who came were denied citizenship. So the Nisei were born, or second generation, were born here as American citizens. But it wasn't until, I believe, 1965 that the first generation could actually become American citizens. So that's a pretty, is that right? 1965?
I think it might be 1951, actually. But 1951 is the Hart-Celler Act, I think, or the McCarran-Walter Act of 1951 is like a precursor to 1965. So you're not far off.
Yeah, I just know that a lot of people became citizens if they were still alive. And so I wanted to bring us into the now, because I started out the speech talking about the rise in Asian American hate crimes. I don't know about you, but I've had some personal experiences with this since the pandemic, and the China being blamed. But particularly, I think it hit home even more so with the Atlanta shootings. And I was appalled at the kind of the response by the police at that time, because there were, I believe, well, out of the people that were murdered, most of them were Asian American women. And the reason was, or the message was, that there is somehow a justification for that violence, somehow a justification that that this killer needed to satisfy some sexual fantasy. Therefore, I really don't know, but I was fairly shocked, and I believe that was the head of the police who made that statement. And so I just wanted to talk, because we're two Asian American women. We have very different backgrounds, I'm sure, but it doesn't matter, because when people see us, we're Asian American women. So what have some of those stereotypes been, and continue to be, that exoticize us, and what impact does that have? I mean, that's a big question, but I think it's an interesting one to bring up now.
Yeah. I think it goes like that like exotification and like hypersexualization of Asian women, it goes back like really far, right? One of the first Chinese women to come to the United States was a woman named Fang Moy, who came to the United States essentially as cargo, as part of a ship carrying, that was captained by traders carrying Chinese porcelains and furniture and basically consumer goods to the United States. And these traders set up essentially a showroom in New York City, featuring all of their all of the things from China that you could buy. And Fang Moy was situated in that room to be like an accessory to this furniture showroom, essentially. So there's that one example. There's also, in 1875, you have the passage of the Page Act, which is a law that essentially limits the immigration of Chinese women coming into the country by themselves, because it essentially operated on the assumption that Chinese women who are coming into the country by themselves would be working as prostitutes. That I think is one of the early examples that we see of, like, I think of white people's racial anxieties eventually becoming codified into law, which then kind of affirms these anxieties. And it's kind of a cyclical process, I think.
Certainly around slavery and Black women's bodies,
Yes.
We don't own our bodies.
Yes,
Somehow our
exactly.
bodies belong to others, not to us. And so the Orientalism that you're talking about, and the whole move during the 60s to change that terminology, just as in the African American community, we are no longer Negro but Black, because that's a self-determining name, as is Asian Americans, as is Asian America. We're not rugs, or we're not items, right, of the Orientalism that was really projected and taught at that time. So but it still exists. And I think, it's perpetuated by things like mail order brides and, things in our American culture that do not lift up women, certainly women of color. So I know that we could go on and talk about that for quite a while, but I think it is an interesting discussion to have, and acknowledging that those attitudes exist, and exist particularly towards women. and Asian women. And so, as we're looking at this racist history of America, not only how we've been portrayed, it all affects where we are today. So, some people call it the cancel culture, but I like to think of it as the consequences of the choices that we've made that define culture. And so, because of this omission of so many stories and so many histories, what impact does that have today, do you think? I mean, and where are we with all of that? I mean, I just heard that the, the conversations on race is being banned from being taught in some public schools. I'm confused about that.
Yeah. I mean, it's like there's no harm in broadening our understanding of the past, in making room for the stories of, all of the people who have made this nation what it is. There's no, it's those stories that aren't told are, they're legitimate histories, and they deserve to be told. And it feels a little bit like we're in this, I don't know, this difficult time where it's like, I don't know, in some ways it feels like this is like the last push before we get over the hill. But at the same time, like, I kind of know that it isn't, because it's a long struggle. But I just think that we should be talking about all of these histories a lot more. And, on top of that, the histories that we don't learn so much about. So the histories of, of Japanese Americans, the histories of Chinese Americans, the histories of refugees, of LGBTQ communities, of migrant workers, of poor people. These are all histories that really, I mean, they're difficult because they are, I think, rooted in oppression and they're rooted in prejudice. But we have to grapple with them to be able to really understand who we are as a people.
Yeah, I totally agree that, I've talked to so many people that go like, wait, you're talking about Chinatown. I'm like, no, I'm talking about, there was a Japantown. They're like, wait, what? There is a Japantown? And so not only do Japanese Americans not know that and carry it forward, right? Or other Asian Americans, but, people that grew up here don't know that. And so my question is always like, why don't you know that? And part of that is, I think, wrapped up into this notion of, Asians being the model minority or being labeled as such.
Mm-hmm.
And what has that done? I mean, on one side, people will say, oh, yes, they're the model minority. Just be like them, follow what they've done, and you too will be American, But what harm has that, I guess, naming of the model minority done to divide and conquer us?
Yeah. Oh my God. I mean, where do we even begin?
Yeah,
I mean, well, first off, I think, like, stereotypes, the model minority is a stereotype, and stereotypes say more about the anxieties of the groups like constructing the stereotype than they do about the groups upon whom this stereotype is imposed. So the model minority stereotype has very specific roots in mid 20th century America, when the nation is in the midst of the Cold War and in the midst of the civil rights movement. So Americans are anxious about communism, and they're also anxious about Black protest, essentially. And so the model minority stereotype, which first gets applied to Japanese Americans as survivors of the incarceration, and then later to Chinese Americans in Chinatowns. This stereotype that these individuals have achieved so much because despite all the obstacles that they've faced, it says a lot. I mean, it's essentially a way of talking about Black Americans without actually mentioning Black Americans. It's a, you know, they're using Asian groups as, I would say, kind of like pawns in this. Yeah, exactly. So the stereotype effectively drives a wedge between Blacks and Asians because it elevates one group while denigrating the other. It, you know, I mean, again, like just the term itself, like model minority, implies that you're comparing it against something. So like, what is that something? Like, what is the basis of comparison? And, you know, you see the model minority, like that stereotype is powerful. And it has really deeply entrenched itself among, I think among Asian communities in the United States, and in the thinking of non-Asian people in the United States too. So, you know, I think on one hand, many Asian Americans kind of like think of it as a point of pride, right? Like they think of the model minority as kind of a good thing. And that is troublesome, that like, you know, that people don't, that more people don't know of like the roots of this stereotype and how it's like very deeply embedded in this very particular moment in American history.
And then it also kind of negates the relationships that Asian Americans built with African Americans, because we're not able to talk about that as we should. And as that the movements kind of came together and one movement inspired the other movement. And I mean, if anyone studies more deeply about the civil rights movement, you see those intersections, right? You see how communities work together because they're very, very closely related. But the stories that are uplifted are those of conflict or those, you know, to set up one. You know, I'm getting a little frustrated because I know we could talk a lot more, and I think that we're supposed to take some questions. We didn't talk about a whole bunch of things, including kind of the connection between the Black reparations movement today and the, which I don't think there's really any comparison, but the reparations movement that I was a part of and worked very hard on for a couple decades. But you know, I just wanted to say, as we're taking questions, Erin, that I really like the quote of Ta-Nehisi Coates when he talked about Black reparations. And he said that, you know, it's more than looking at the past. It's more than recompense for the past injustices. It's more than a handout, a payoff, or hush money, or a reluctant bribe. He said what he is talking about is a national reckoning that would lead to a spiritual renewal. And I think that there are many of us that are just on that path too, that until we have this reckoning, historic reckoning, that we can't move forward. So Erin,
Yes.
Are there like one or two questions?
Well, I'll just say really quickly, yes, if people have questions, you can submit them in the chat or the Q&A or a comment. I do have a comment here from Kelly saying that they had no idea Japantown existed and they live in Northwest Portland. So you really, it's so true. I mean, I can think of a question, but you can, I know this is like kind of a lot maybe, but I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the relationship between the organizations that you're both involved in and people who are directly affected or part of those histories that are shared through the museum, through Vanport. I know they build awareness, but it seems really clear there is also a lot of it that is for people to, as you've both talked about, like kind of connect with their own past and their identities too.
Well, I can talk about Vanport Mosaic a little bit because we have this festival coming up, and it definitely is, when you study the history of Vanport, the city of Vanport, which was the second largest city in Oregon, or was it Washington? I don't know. It's both, partly Vancouver and partly Portland. The Japanese Americans settled there or had no other choice but to go there after they were released from concentration camps because people had nothing. They were given $25 and a bus ticket. Some people say a train ticket, but I don't know. It was a ticket to go where? To go where, to survive how? And so over 300, and you were encouraged not to congregate with your own kind. There was a booklet that said, in order for you to reintegrate or join society again, you should stay away from these things, like congregating with people of your own kind. And so Vanport became, I think of it as almost an experiment without knowing it was an experiment, because originally it was, brought to build the ships, and Henry Kaiser started that. And it was almost, I feel like it was almost an accident. Like, we just need to get as many people here that we can to build our ships. And he was able to get federal housing money. And that's when the greatest percentage of African Americans came to Portland, and they stayed in Portland. So there's a direct history between that history of Vanport and where we are today. So I would say that the repairing and restoring and reclaiming those histories is a part of what Vanport Mosaic does. And it's also a part of what the Japanese American Museum, I'm on the board of the Japanese American Museum of Oregon. And this is, an amazing time to open a new museum, right, Jennifer? During a pandemic. But it was built during this time. And so I really encourage everyone on this call to take a moment to go to the Japanese American Plaza and look at more than the trees, look at that historic wall that holds that history, and the museum. So maybe you could tell us a little bit more about, and you were at the Chinatown Museum before you came to the Japanese Museum.
Can I just, sorry, one really quick. So I think it's technically the end of the session. I'm not sure if it'll like automatically kick people out, but we're still in our Zoom session. So I think if you want to continue that, I also did just get a question, which I can read, and it'll be recorded. So even if people get kicked out of the session or leave, I think we'll have it recorded. So I think go ahead. Sorry to interrupt.
Thank you.
I'll just say real quickly that, yes, the Japanese American Museum is open. We are currently in the soft opening phase where we're open to museum members. We call them Friends of JAMO. But beginning June 18th, we'll be open to the general public by reservation. So, please reach out to us if you want to come and visit, make a reservation. The new museum is wonderful. And I think that the exhibits are just really well done. They're really moving. I will say real quickly that, something that I've noticed working at the Japanese American Museum of Oregon, and also in the few years that I was at the Portland Chinatown Museum too, is that these institutions kind of serve a dual purpose. They serve two different but connected audiences. On one hand, they serve the groups of people of whom this story is about, right? And what's amazing about both institutions is that that story it's a story that is controlled by and being told by the actual community members. And so there's a, there's a very significant degree of agency there, which is really important when you're telling the stories of marginalized people. Like, you want those groups, those individuals, to be the ones telling that story. So I feel like those, those organizations serve the groups. Like, they serve Japanese Americans, they serve Chinese Americans, they serve as points of pride and points of knowledge and resources for those communities. And at the same time, like, they also serve a general audience, right? Because, like, the history of Japanese people in Oregon, of Chinese people in Oregon, of course, that is a history of a distinct group of people, but it's also the history of Oregon, right? Like,
Yes.
these people helped make the state what it is. The economy and the industries of this state depended, and like in a very critical way, depended upon the labor of Japanese and Chinese migrants. So, without those individuals, you wouldn't have the development of this state. And so for that reason, it's like the histories of these groups of people really shouldn't be relegated to like one paragraph or like a page or a week in history education. It needs to be like deeply integrated into the way that we think about this place where we live.
Before we leave, I wanted to lift up the last weekend in not January, this is June. The last weekend in June, my time warp. In the North Park blocks, you will see some amazing history shown and shared, not only of the museums in that area, but programs and institutions that you might not know anything about. And these are also the voices who have created Oregon. So I think we have about 60 panels. We were, fortunate to have all the windows on the west side of the park blocks will be exhibiting the history of all of these organizations that you might not know about. So join us. It's an in-person festival the last weekend in June, and come and meet people and celebrate and come back out into the world. So I want to thank you, Jennifer, for taking your time today. And again, I want to thank the Jewish Federation of Oregon, the Japanese American Museum of Oregon, and Vanport Mosaic, and Aaron for all your technical assistance. And I'm sure that there's more questions, and if you leave those, we'll try to get back to you, circle around and answer them. But I think it was great. We had fun.
Yes. Thank you. I will just mention, so yes, I will pass on. There are a couple of questions, and I'm so sorry that we didn't get to them, because of somebody, spent their time and effort putting the question in. So I'm going to definitely pass those on to y'all, and it doesn't tell me who said it, but they might give you, they're definitely like questions that would give you a whole other, it could be a whole event. So maybe we'll inspire, some ideas.
Our next session,
important, yes, future conversations that I think people are really interested in having.
Great, perfect. Thank you, everybody, for joining us in this session, and I hope you join some other sessions today in the summit. And I look forward to meeting you all in person one day.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Okay, thanks.